Sprue cutters are not made equal. What cutters should you use on 3D printed parts? Hi, I'm Chris, the modeler at ABR Modelworks. In this video I'll show you the difference between the different types of sprue cutters, what to look out for when buying a sprue cutter, and what's the difference between cutting parts for a plastic kit and those that are 3D printed. First up, I'd like to thank Hobbytech Toys for their generous support in helping us with this video. They loaned me all of the sprue cutters you'll see in this video. So what's the difference between cutting the sprues away on a 3D printed part as opposed to the parts in a plastic kit? Well, 3D printed parts are grown in a vat of 3D resin, layer by layer, and that process requires a lot more support. Whereas plastic parts are on a heavier sprue where the plastic is injected into the part. Now, the finer the printed 3D part, or the heavier the 3D part, requires more sprues to support it during the printing process. So as an example, this 3D printed window has a whole series of little supports all running across what is actually the bottom of the window. Each of those supports line up with the panes in the window to support them in the printing process. Whereas this batch of doors attached to a sprue only have one connection point, and that's because the part is supported in the mould during the moulding process. As you can see, at the moment I have the workbench set up and I'm working on the dioramas for the fire escapes. But because I've got quite a few 3D printed parts to cut, I thought this would be an ideal time to test out a range of different sprue cutters. We've had a couple of customers that have had a few issues with cutting some of the parts. And so I've got from the very cheapest through to what is supposed to be the very best. I'm going to use each of them and give you my thoughts on them. As well as that, I'm going to photograph the blades separately and talk a little bit about the blade and how they work, etc., and what to look for, and why things like side cutters and scissors are really no good for sprue cutting. So I'll get on to cutting some of the parts and give you my thoughts. So for the first cut exercise, I'm cutting one of the doors for the fire escape stairs and a window from a typical sprue from a model kit. I'm doing this for each of the cutters to get a first impression of how they compare cut-wise against each other. Okay, so first up, the hobby side cutter. This is a relatively cheap set of cutters, about $20 Australian. I don't particularly like pressed steel cutters for a couple of reasons. One is that they never absolutely line up properly, so you'll see that when I take some photographs of the jaws, etc. Now these are actually mine, and the reason why I chose these is that the point goes together quite finely, and so where you've got something that's a little difficult to get into, these aren't bad for doing that. They won't be my go-to cutters, but they'll be for that particular purpose where I just want to cut something right at the tip of the cutter, because some of the other cutters are a little bit wide at that point. As far as the cuts are concerned, cut through everything, no problem, but the angle of the blades is such that there is a little bit of extra pressure and it has chipped the door a little bit. So not the best, but not a bad entry level cutter. The Tamiya cutter, this one's the modeler's side cutter. It probably did a slightly better job. Still a couple of small little chips that, you know, with a little bit of sanding, you can clean them up like on both. Handled the cutting of the window away from the sprue, and of course cut through the heavy part of the sprue without any problems. The next one's the Green Stuff World flat cutting nipper, and it's done quite a nice job. No real cuts into the plastic where we don't want it, because sometimes you can get a scalloping effect, so not too bad. So they're roughly $30 Australian. The Citadel, nice solid feel about them, very, very good. Again, the blades, like the rest of the pressed steel cutters, are a little bit on the steep side, so they're pushing things away a little bit. Not super excited. It didn't get in particularly close, so there's a lot more cleanup to do with these cutters on the door. Again, handled the plastic sprue no problem at all. Now the next set of cutters I actually own myself, And the reason why that came about was because my lovely daughter got hold of my original cutters, probably cut some wire, and because they were made from pressed steel, the jaws separated. I've been able to get them fairly close together again by giving them a twist, but they no longer cut as well as they used to. What I've done with these is I've ground the ends of them to make it a little bit more finer so I can get into tight spots. But they've done a reasonably good job. Still not the best. These are called the build-up nipper. Not too bad a job, not quite as fine. Again, these are pressed steel. There's still a bit of cleanup to be done. That you just can't get the cutter close enough to get that last little bit of material away. These are the second of the non-pressed steel. These are forged, and from what I've seen so far, the forged type of cutter I think is the one that I will be recommending. So this is from SMS, and these were a little bit of a surprise. They've cut really well, nice and clean, not a lot of cleanup to be done. Of the cutting so far, by far the best actually, so very happy with those. And then last of all, the God Hand, which is what a lot of modelers rave about. These are the go-to. They're made in Japan, and like a lot of Japanese products, you know, they're very much a precision tool, and again they have cut very close, minimal cleanup. On some things you'd cut away, you probably wouldn't be needing to doing any cleanup at all. These have cut slightly closer than the SMS, not a lot. The SMS ones, $55 Australian, and of course the Goddard ones, that's roughly $120. Is it worth the extra? I think so. I like a nice precision tool, but I'm very happy with these. So I'm sort of a little bit on the fence as to which ones I would go for. Knowing my buying habits of the past, I tend to go for quality products, so I may in fact get a pair of each of them and see how they go over time. At the cheaper end of the marketplace, look, if you just need to start out, now I've used both of these. This one's probably a little bit better in the Tamiya, but not as fine a point. So again, that's a little bit of a 50-50 decision. For around $30, Green Stuff World flat cut nipper is very good. Although I like the feel, probably not. These ones, I think now that I'm probably going to go down the path of maybe getting some of these. I probably would maybe not use that one as much. Yeah, for $50, it's nice and fine that way. It probably just needs a little bit more of a chamfer on the end. So maybe I'll get a pair of those, modify the jaw just a little bit so I can get into some of the tighter areas, and then these ones I'll leave as they are, and we'll see how they go over time. I'm now cutting a set of windows for the fire escape. We're using each of the cutters. In this sequence, I'm using the Green Stuff World flat cutting nipper to cut the landing and landing railing for the fire escape. I'm now using a pair of the dual edge nippers from SMS to cut the landing railing and landing. And finally I'm using a pair of the God Hand cutters also to cut a landing railing and landing platform. Now, after using the Green Stuff World, the SMS and the God Hand cutters to cut parts like the fire escape, they are delicate and need a little bit more care. So I have absolutely no hesitation in recommending this style of cutter for this type of work. So let's look at how cutters actually cut and what's happening. I've included scissors and side cutters in this diagram. The blades on scissors overlap each other as the cut is made, and so that causes the sprue to be pushed sideways as you cut through it. This adds a lot of stress to the model and the sprues beside the sprue you're cutting. It can also cause the model to break and chip. So I absolutely don't recommend scissors at all. Side cutters are almost as bad as scissors. The difference is the thickness of the blade pushes the sprue away from the model, again stressing other connecting sprues and potentially causing the model to break and chip parts of the model away. Pressed metal sprue cutters are a relatively good option. I've been using them for years. The downside of them is that the blade is thicker than the forged cutters, which on delicate parts can cause breakage and chipping of parts. And lastly, one of the problems with pressed metal sprue cutters is in which the way the blades are actually joined together. The pivot point on most of the cutters I've tried seems to have quite a bit of slop in it. This slop allows the blades to overbite or cross over each other like a pair of scissors. that adds quite a lot of stress when you're cutting the sprue away from the model. The forged cutters are by far the best. They have a nice tight pivot point. They cut very close to the model itself, and because the lift or the separation when the sprue is cut is much less than the other cutters, there's a lot less stress applied and much less chance of chipping or breaking the part itself. So I absolutely recommend that style of cutter. Now there is one drawback with forged cutters. The tips are quite fine, and if you drop them on concrete they're likely to break. So you need to make sure that you're careful with them, as the metal is a lot more brittle than the pressed metal style of cutter. Now let's look at the blades of the pressed metal cutters. Each of the following photos start with the cutter in its package, followed by a series of photos of the blades. When you look at the blades you can see things like what the gap is, how close they come together at the point, and how thick the blades are themselves. You can stop the video at any point to study each blade individually. This next group of cutters are the forged cutters, and again starting with the individual cutter and its blades. That the SMS and Godhand cutters are very similar in terms of the shape of their blade. The main difference is the fineness of the grinding and sharpening of the blade itself. In terms of recommendation, maybe I would perhaps skip these, spend the extra $10 on those. The ones in the middle probably wouldn't buy if they were, again, if I was going through this, but certainly these two, very good. So all in all, like a lot of things, there is an improvement as you go through price. Final thoughts and recommendations on the cutters. Now I have all of the cutters that I used laid out, and I'll go through those in a moment, but as you can see the fire escape diorama is almost finished. Now these are the pressed metal cutters that I used, and as I've said in the video, they all do an okay job. The only one that was disappointed was the Citadel one, and I would not recommend buying it simply because the pivot point is not particularly accurate and the jaws cross over each other too much. But the other ones are good, and I would certainly have any one of those in my tool collection. So you've got a cutter that's suitable for cutting plastic and cutting some of the heavier 3D parts. In the forged metal cutters, again, they all did a good job. The ones that I would go for would be, in fact, these three. The Green Stuff World cutters, the SMS cutters, and the Godhand cutters. The quality of cut basically goes up with the price of the cutter, but marginally between the SMS and the Godhand. The main reason why the Godhand is better is that when you look at the cutter itself, the sharpening and grinding process of the blades is much finer, so it gives you a cleaner cut. Having said that though, these are really good. I absolutely recommend them, and of all the cutters that I've looked at, these would be my first choice from a value for money point of view, followed by the Godhand cutters, and then followed by the Green Stuff. So they're the three recommendations that I will make for 3D parts. Again, they all did a reasonably good job, and I definitely have a set of pressed metal cutters in my toolbox. So a pair of pressed metal cutters, a pair of the forged cutters, and you'd have a good combination of tools to be able to work with all the different scenarios you're likely to come across. Now of course the recommendations that I've now made are based on these cutters. There may be other cutters in the marketplace equally as good or even better. If you have a favourite set of cutters that you feel do a great job, make a note in the comments for us. Now thanks again to Hobby Tech Toys for loaning us these cutters for this video. Without them we would not have been able to produce it. There are links below for all of the cutters, and of course details on how you can purchase these cutters from Hobby Tech Toys, so please support them as they've supported us. I hope this video has been helpful, and please, if you've got any suggestions, leave them in the comments below. We'd love to hear from you. I'm Chris the Modeler at ABR Modelworks. Thanks for watching, And don't forget to subscribe to the channel. And please add any comments about any future videos or tools you'd like to be reviewed in the comments below.